Good morning. Do we have a quorum?
Yes, we do.
Perfect. I'll get us started here once I get my iPad up here. Okay, perfect. I'd like to call to order the special meeting of the Joint Organizational Governance Committee and the Board of Retirement and Board of Investments. Today is Wednesday, July 21st, and the time is 8 a.m. First item will be at the staff comments.
Thank you, Chair Kehoe. This meeting is being conducted as a virtual meeting, so I will do a roll call of the trustees to confirm attendance. I will start off with the committee members. Please note, Mr. Robbins and Mr. Knox will not be attending the meeting. Mr. Santos?
Here.
Thank you. Mr. Kelly?
Here.
Thank you. Ms. Gray?
Morning, here.
Thank you. Miss Greenwood? Okay. Mr. Bernstein?
Here.
Thank you. And Chair Kehoe?
Present.
Thank you. And I will start off by calling on the Board of Retirement members. Ms. Zapata? Ms. Ginsburg?
Here.
Thank you. Mr. Harris? Mr. Moore? Mr. Oakham? Mr. Pryor? Board of Investment Trustees, Mr. Green?
Here.
Thank you. Mr. Jones? Ms. Sanchez? Ms. Ginsburg? Okay, that concludes attendance. Ms. Ginsburg, wait, oh yeah, I already had you, sorry. Staff participating in the meeting include the following: CEO Santos Freeman, Deputy CEO Luis Lugo, Chief Counsel Stephen Rive, CIO John Grable, AEO JJ Popovich, HR Division Manager Carly Natoya, and our Communication Division Manager Cynthia Martinez. Consultants participating in the meeting include Bob Klausner from Klausner, Kaufman, Jensen, and Levinson, and Ashley Dunning from Nossaman. Trustees, please use the Zoom chat option to be placed in the queue. At this time, we ask all meeting participants to mute their mics, and we will proceed with the agenda.
Great, thank you. Next item is the approval of the minutes of the June 16th meeting.
So moved.
Second.
Moved by Ms. Gray, seconded by Mr. Kelly.
Okay, Mr. Santos?
Yes.
Thank you. Mr. Kelly?
Yes.
Thank you. Ms. Gray?
Yes.
Thank you. Mr. Bernstein?
Aye.
Thank you. Ms. Greenwood? Just checking to see if she's here. Okay, and Chair Kehoe?
Aye.
Thank you. The motion passes.
Perfect, thank you. That brings us to our public comment period. Have we received any requests from the public to speak?
We have not received any requests.
Okay, perfect. That brings us along to our non-consent items. If there's no objection under discussions with council and on these items, we'd like to swap item B and C. So we'll hear item A, and then we'll hear item C, and then we'll hear item B. That allows us to incorporate anything, if we decide to go that direction, to incorporate anything into the code of ethical conduct. So if there's no objection, we will proceed with the agenda like that. And that brings us to item A, which is the use of name policy presented by staff. We have a memo dated July 12th, 2021. And I'll go ahead and turn that over to Ms. Rice for a brief introduction of this proposed policy.
Thank you, Chair Kehoe, and good morning, trustees. An organization's name has huge value to it in standing for the best of the organization. In private industry, an organization's name has economic value, and use of name policies are common for that purpose. As a public entity, we're at LACERA not so concerned about economic value, but what we are very concerned about is maintaining the integrity of the organization and recognizing the fact that the organization's name stands for the integrity with which the organization performs its mission, vision, and values. LACERA right now does not have a use of name policy. There are references to use of LACERA property in the Code of Ethical Conduct, but the name is only referenced once, and I believe it's actually with reference to the logo, and it's in the section 10 on political activities. So while use of LACERA property could be construed to cover use of the name and the logo, there's no direct policy that really on a comprehensive basis addresses this issue. Trustee Kelly suggested some time ago that we fill that gap and adopt a use of name policy. In developing the JOGC agenda for this year, we placed this item on the agenda at this meeting in order to have a discussion by the committee and discuss what steps the committee may wish to recommend to the boards in this area. We have prepared a proposed policy, which you have. It addresses the issue in pretty broad terms in recognition that as a public agency, there are some fairly broad and permissive standards that apply to the use of our name, but nevertheless recognizing that the name does have value to LACERA and that there are limits on it and that the organization cares about how its name is used. The policy discusses general principles. It discusses use of name by internal parties, including both trustees and staff, and then it discusses use of name by external parties, including vendors, LACERA vendors with whom we have contractual relationships and therefore have some control through that vehicle, and then also external parties with whom we do not have a relationship, but that we would not want to misuse our name. Instead of going through the policy in further detail with that general introduction, I'm happy to address any comments, and the goal of this item again is to get direction from the committee as to whether this is a policy, this type of policy is something that the committee wants to recommend, and if so, what its content should be, and to receive direction from the committee in those areas. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rice. My first take on the policy when looking it over was that I felt like it was redundant, that it was already covered in our Code of Ethical Conduct. There's a couple of references in there about how to use our names or titles beyond just the political side of things. But I'd like to open it up to the rest of the committee to get some initial thoughts on it, if this seems to be necessary as an independent policy, if it's something that we should just incorporate and enhance our Code of Ethical Conduct that we're going to talk about later, or if it's something that we receive and file and proceed with. So I will open it up, and I have Ms. Gray with the first comment.
Thank you and good morning. I think this is a very serious issue that we need to address carefully, because we certainly don't want to infringe on, number one, the use of name being LACERA or its logo, but we also want to adjust that so that it coincides with the right to free speech. One thing I think that is important is that reading over this policy, particularly with item 3, internal persons, the one thing that I felt was important was that trustees can have the freedom to use the name LACERA, not only in its communications with members, but particularly personally in terms of identifying themselves only. I think that we do have a duty of loyalty to LACERA. We have a fiduciary duty, but we also are allowed to identify ourselves as trustees And I liked the statement that it is only for purposes of identification. I think that's as far as we need to go. I think this is something that we have been doing. In Mr. Rice's memo, on page 2 at the top of the page, the first paragraph, he mentions a fair reading of the current policy precludes the use of the name LACERA. In other words, we are not speaking as, quote, representatives of LACERA in the personal aspect. And it says except to identify themselves. And I think that is an important point and something that we have been doing. I don't think that we need to change it. What we need to do is make sure that both the use of name policy is concurrent with our code of ethical conduct. Having a use of name policy, I agree with, and I think this is what Mr. Kehoe has said, that it's kind of redundant. So I think the most important thing as fiduciary duties is to have a code of ethical conduct. The use of name policy really refers to trustees, but it also refers to vendors. However, I believe that we already have a policy with respect to vendors in terms of contractual policies that they may sign, and in terms of vendors, providing services to us. So those are my comments.
Thank you, Ms. Gray. Mr. Kelly. You're on mute.
Good morning. I actually think it should be broken out into its own policy because it is applicable to external parties, I think much more so than our code of ethical conduct. And I don't know if an external party who's interested in understanding use of name would look to our ethical code of conduct. And so I am supportive of breaking it out. I also think that what's in code of ethical conduct right now isn't necessarily sufficient. So we do need to beef it up. And when you beef it up, I think that also aligns with the mode of extracting it. I do think, as somebody who uses LACERA's name, for example, I write a monthly summary of for the RELAC newsletter of what's going on Board of Investments. What I didn't find is some discussion about what is an allowable use of LACERA's name. Can I refer to LACERA's Board of Investments in terms of repeating factual information? So I thought that was one thing that needed to be there to inform both internal and external parties. I also think there needed to be some more discussion about processes by which one requests to use LACERA's name. That was void to me. I didn't see that there. Because someone might want to submit a request to say, I want to use LACERA's name, and we might want to, the CEO might want to consider that. And then some procedures, a little bit more about what the violation process looks like. I thought that was a bit vague. And I sent some other more or less material comments to Mr. Rice yesterday. But I think it does need to be broken out because it is applicable to both internal and external. And I think the way that Mr. Rice has laid it out in terms of looking at code of conduct, media, and use of name as individual policies, but as a collective guide, I think that's the right way to go on this one. So I'm supportive of it being a distinct document, but I do think we need to see another draft fine-tuned a little bit. I think it was in some cases particularly broad, which is a good thing, but in other cases I thought it needed to provide more guidance to someone who actually wanted to use LACERA's name and to see if that was legit or not. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly. Mr. Santos.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree with you, Mr. Kehoe. This is redundant. And we have all this in the Code of Ethics. Therefore, I move that we receive and file this document.
Have a motion for receiving and file. I have Ms. Gray seconding. Okay, that's the motion on the table, is to receive and file the document. Any additional comments or thoughts from the committee?
I have a substitute motion, which is to incorporate this enhanced wording into the ethical code of conduct.
I'm hearing a substitute motion to incorporate the enhanced wording into the code of ethical conduct. And I do not hear a second on the item. Okay, so the motion that we have on the table right now is to receive and file this document.
Mr. Chair, as a point of order,
Yes, Mr. Kelly.
the committee makes recommendations to the full board. Do we have the authority to say receive and file this, or is the recommendation to the full boards to receive and file it?
I'll ask for clarification from Mr. Rice, but my belief is that we can receive and file it, and any trustee on the entire boards can always ask for an item to be agendized for their respective board or committee that they serve on. But Mr. Rice, is that accurate?
Yes, there's no obligation on the committee's part to send every item that it considers up to the boards. Particularly if there's a recommendation to be made, then yes, it goes up to the board. If there's no recommendation in the committee, there's nothing for the board to do. If it wants to be brought, if there's a need to bring it to the boards, then that could be done by individual trustees through the process that we have in the bylaws or in other ways as well, the chair, other means. But there's no requirement that the this committee forward a receive and file to the boards.
Understood.
And I see Mr. Bernstein is up next. I just want to comment that one thing to consider is we have the code of ethical conduct coming up that's agendized. So I'm not opposed to the current motion. I'm in support of the current motion to receive and file this. And then we can discuss any incorporation or enhancement at the time that we get to the code of ethical conduct. So I think that that meets everybody's expectations on it. Mr. Bernstein.
I'm largely in line with Ms. Gray's comments. I don't have anything to add substantially. I will say, although it may be a legal move, I don't support receive and file. I think that we are meant to be a deliberative body that gives information on to our boards. And I would just respectfully ask, I'm not asking that we take action on this item, but I think it should just appear as an FYI item on both of the board's agendas. I think that one of the criticisms of the JOGC is that it's viewed as sort of an offset, separate body. Our opinion is no action is taken. It looks like that's where the votes are, but I would much prefer that we forward it along as FYI to the boards. And I would respectfully ask the motion makers to consider adjusting the motion, not to change the action, but to change the execution of where the information goes.
And just one thought on that is that this is agendized meeting. It was sent to all trustees on both boards. It's agendized for all three boards. Every trustee has this information. So I don't think that sending it as an FYI, unless that becomes our standard practice that this board does or this committee does. And I'm concerned that doing that gets a little redundant and overboard on it. And then as a second note, I do think that we're going to have an opportunity to discuss some of these particulars when we get to the code of ethical conduct. So we might have that issue resolved. That's my initial thoughts off the top of my head, but I will pause for a few moments if anybody has any additional comments or thoughts. Seeing none, the motion is for receiving and filing this specific use of name policy. Let's go ahead and do a roll call vote.
Okay, Mr. Santos?
Yes.
Thank you. Mr. Kelly?
No.
Thank you. Ms. Gray?
Yes.
I just want to see if Ms. Greenwood is on yet. I don't see her. Okay, Mr. Bernstein?
Aye.
Thank you. And Chair Kehoe?
Aye.
Thank you. The motion passes with 4 yeses and 1 no.
Yeah, thank you. That brings us to item C, which we're going to adjust to item B. That is the requesting input to staff on the possible revisions of LACERA's media policy and to make recommendations to the Board of Retirement or Board of Investments as we deem appropriate. We have the document dated July 12th, 2021, which includes attachments with our current media policy, which I'll point out does not appear to be adopted by the boards. So that's an issue I think we need to address as a committee. We also have the proposed external communications policy revision and the presentation by our fiduciary council. I'll go ahead and this is very similar to the one that we have, except for this is apparently an existing policy that once again is not adopted by the boards. My feeling on this is that we suggest some minor revisions and suggest adoption by both boards and move this forward to both boards. I have some very minor grammatical and content changes that I can mention, but I'll go ahead and open it up to the rest of the committee to discuss to see what direction we want to go with the media policy. I have Mr. Kelly in the queue.
Thank you. I appreciated the opportunity to review it. I had two comments. The first is that there's no mention of the role of the communications consultant, and I think there should be. And the second is I would look somehow for Santos Kreiman, our CEO, to tweak the policy as necessary to consider our recent interactions with an activist community group on a matter. There's no mention of that whatsoever, and I think it's prudent to at least have a sit down and a conversation to see if that impacts this policy at all. Those were my two comments.
Okay. Additional comments by committee members or board members?
Yes, Mr. Kehoe. I'm pretty much in agreement with you, Mr. Kehoe, with regards to we already have a lot of this in the policy and perhaps minor revisions. The one that I have the biggest concern is item 3, which pretty much will not allow me to, if I meet one of our partners at an event and ask them how a fund is doing. The biggest example is JP Morgan. JP Morgan handles the private equity emerging manager program. And from time to time, excuse me, from time to time when I see them, it's usually like maybe once a year, maybe every 2 years, I ask them, how are we doing with a program in there? And Section 3 takes that ability for me to do that. And I believe it's part of my fiduciary duty to inquire. So this suggestion here is, I will never be in favor of this, because we have to have the ability to ask in that fashion. We can communicate with that. So anyway, I'm against that.
What section specifically? I have it up under LACERA board members.
I think the reference. I think the reference is to the memo. Excuse me. Yeah.
Right. So we have communications on behalf of LACERA. Number 1 is speech and presentations. 2, communications with legislators, and 3, communications with vendors and potential vendors. So 3 is the one that I'm objecting to on page 2 of the memo.
I'm trying to locate, is it under attendance at conferences and other public meetings, or?
What page is it?
Chair Keogh, if I might help, I think what Mr. Trustee Santos is referring to is the second page of the staff memo on this item.
What's the
And
page number?
Item 3, it would be page number 48
Oh,
in
48.
the packet.
Oh, okay. But so Mr. Rice, when you're hearing the comments from Mr. Santos in the actual policy itself, where would that be restricted in the existing policy? I believe it's not, and you were suggesting an addition.
Actually, these were just areas. They weren't actually even suggestions for policy changes. They were just suggestions to guide the discussion, because this was requested to be a committee review item. So these were just 6 areas for possible discussion, not a recommendation for any specific changes.
Okay, got it. Okay. Understood. So, and at this point, in support of Mr. Santos's comments, at this point, we haven't recommended any additions to the policy to that effect. So at this point, we're good on that. The comments that I have as far as just some minor things, we say chief administrative officer at the top should be chief executive officer for the county. We say chief executive, I would say assistant executive officer, AEC, which is actually AEO. And we should now incorporate Mr. Lugo as the deputy executive officer as well. On the second to last paragraph on the media policy itself, where it starts with on occasion, the CEO, CIO, or AEO may designate a particular staff member. It says such designations will be made only to senior staff members. I think we should strike the word senior and just say it should be only made to staff members who are technically proficient with respect to the subject of the designation and who can effectively deal with media representatives. And I suggest we strike out the possess the maturity and discretion. That I don't believe should be in a policy. I think it's also talks down to employees that aren't designated to be media representative. So I think that should just be striked. And obviously, senior staff, there might be a case where you have somebody who's a technical expert who's not a senior staff member that's used to talk to the media. So tying our hands on those 2 issues, I think we should lighten that up. All of that is under the discretion clearly from the CEO, CIO, and AEO and deputy executive officer. So it's not like you're going to have a rogue employee running out there talking to the media without senior executive oversight on that. So on page 2, I also noted that it said should be reported to the boards. I think it should be reported to the respective board. But other than that, so just very minor changes on my end. I would like to hear again from Mr. Kelly on his thoughts to incorporate, but let's first hear from Ms. Gray, and then we can proceed.
I am so sorry I asked for comment, but I really wanted to know where. Okay, maybe on my iPad, it's not coming through. But are you looking at the actual policy itself, Sean, or?
Yeah, page 51, or sorry, it's 51 from the iPad, 51 out of page 123.
Okay.
That's the actual policy. So the discussion that my suggestion is the discussion for this committee would be simply to discuss the existing media policy, incorporate any changes that we want here, and then decide if we ask staff to bring it back to the committee or if we simply direct staff to bring it forward to both boards. At this point, this policy is not adopted by the boards, so I think that's something that needs to be resolved since it is addressing board member issues. So number one, I do think no matter what, we need to either adopt or do something with this policy. And then my suggestion were just some minor changes that I just noted on there.
Okay, and that's with respect to our media policy.
Correct.
Okay. I'll come back. There was one little minor item that I saw also.
I have Mr. Santos. I'll go to Mr. Santos, and then if you want, I'll come back to you.
Thank you.
Okay. Mr. Santos.
Thank you, Mr. Kehoe. I'm in agreement with your suggested changes, and I will make a motion that we adopt this policy and recommend adoption of this policy by both boards, including the changes that Mr. Kehoe suggested.
I will second.
I think it's moved and seconded. That's the item for discussion right now. That's the motion on the table. And I will go back to Ms. Gray as promised.
Kehoe, my comment is that I'm in agreement with you. I've noted the minor changes, and I agree that part of it is kind of talking down to our staff and trustees also. So I agree with the changes, and I'm in support of the motion.
Thank you. Back to Mr. Kelly.
I think the motion specifically excludes my comments, and I just wanted to confirm that.
So what I was going to do is go back to you to talk about your comments. So we're here. So let's go ahead and.
Okay, so I had two comments. The first is the media policy does not discuss or mention that we have a contract with a communications consultant and the role of that consultant. And I think it's appropriate to do so. Second, there's no comment from Mr. Kryman that he had reviewed the media policy in light of our recent experience with an activist community regarding an investment. And I think it would have been prudent to have heard from Mr. Kryman on that. If he did have that discussion incorporated into the media policy, fine. But we should hear from I would be interested in hearing from Mr. Kryman if he had that discussion with his executive team and if anything came up that warranted inclusion in the media policy.
Okay, before we move on to that item, let's go back to the consultant item. So what specifically would you like added? And then we can ask the motion maker.
We have a role of a consultant and what the consultant's role is and how we incorporate that consultant into the evaluation of information and dissemination of information.
Mr. Rice, can you comment on that? Would we be able to incorporate a paragraph on the consultant that's consistent with the existing media policy?
Yes, we have a board-approved consultant. We have a scope of work, and I think that can be used to distill the information down that's appropriate for this policy into a paragraph.
Okay. Mr. Santos, Mr. Bernstein, would you be accepting of that amendment to the existing motion?
My view at this point, if I may, Mr. Kehoe, is that we need to be careful with these policies that we don't, they are so overbroad that it interferes with the CEO's abilities or micromanage the CEO. I mean, the board already approved the hire of this consultant, and this consultant is to be used by the CEO in his capacity when either he's directed by the board or he in his capacity as a CEO believes there is a need to use that consultant. So it's already incorporated in the process. So, I mean, it doesn't really make much changes. I just really concerned that we begin to micromanage what the CEO and his ability to make decisions regarding this issue. I don't know if Mr. Kryman has a comment on that, but I mean, that's just my feeling. So I'm not too convinced that we really need to include that in here because it will be redundant. That's just my view.
Can I ask, Mr. Rice, are we legally protected based on the scope of work designation that if we don't incorporate the consultant element in the policy, that our scope of work protects the organization as far as media involvement?
Well, the scope of work defines the services that we've engaged this consultant to perform. It doesn't address when we will use them and it's also not it's a public document, but it's not a public facing document in the sense that it's out there on LACERA.com or any other place. But it certainly protects us with respect to the availability of those services, and the CEO is the manager of that policy, along with the communications office.
So, Mr. Rice, what's the recommendation from legal? Should we incorporate the consultant element in this policy, or should we, or are we sufficient with the existing stance of having it in the scope of work? I think we just need clear direction from staff on this to the trustees.
Yeah, I think it might be more of an executive recommendation from Mr. Kryman than a legal recommendation. The legal perspective would be simply that, to the extent that this policy attempts, and I think it does, to mention all of the LACERA parties involved in dealing with media issues, that a recognition that we have a consultant simply that fact, and maybe a limited amount of additional information around that, and the staff oversight of that consultant would certainly not detract from the policy, and would arguably make it more complete. But again, I think it's really not a legal determination.
Okay, so if I'm in support of adding it to the policy, it doesn't sound like there's any risk to adding it to the policy. I think that it helps expand on it. And I think that legal can craft that paragraph to not tie the hands of the CEO, and do simply redirect our consultants to our media policy. So I'm actually not opposed to that amendment on there. I turn it back to you, Mr. Santos, on if you'd like to recommend the adjustment, or we can hear from Mr. Kryman on this specifically.
I'm in agreement with you as long as legal does draft the language as you suggested to ensure the CEO's ability to manage this relationship as appropriate.
Okay, thank you. So, Mr. Bernstein, are you in support of
I am.
that minor change?
Yes,
Okay.
I accept the friendly amendment.
Okay, perfect. And then I will turn this back to Mr. Kryman to address the activist element. Mr. Kelly had asked if you had an opportunity to review this policy, and if you have any thoughts on that before we proceed.
I have reviewed the policy, and I have not had a specific conversation with the executive team about incorporating the activist element into the media policy. That being said, I believe that that the issues that we've been dealing with in terms of the activists, they're varied, and it really, the tool that we use is really dependent on what is being asked of us, or what the other party is alleging, or so I think, to the extent that we're going to craft it the way the Mr. Rice has suggested, I think that would be perfectly fine. I think we do need to recognize that we do have a consultant that was assisting us with media activities. My preference is that that we're not very specific. That gives us or the executive team the opportunity to make decisions quickly, without having to go back to the policy and say, well, does it allow us to do it? We just need a little bit more latitude, quite frankly, to make these sort of decisions. So those are my comments.
Okay. And I lost track of the comments on my side. Was there anybody that had additional comments? I see Ms. Gray had raised her hand. So I will turn it over to you, Ms. Gray. If anybody else has some comments, please type in right now, and I'll know you're waiting.
My comment refers particularly to Mr. Santos, Chairman Santos' comment about not tying the hands of our CEO, and also our CIO, who consistently has to deal with the media, that it is the media that he deals with is obviously specific to our investments, but we don't want to tie their hands. And I don't expect Mr. Grable, when he's responding to, say, I don't know, pension and investments or some other media outlet, that he has to refer. I don't want his hands tied, particularly by this policy. I think that Mr. Grable has always used the proper judgment, and it does fall within the policy. So I think that if we were to add an additional line about the media consultant, I think it's really with respect to their work that we have agreed to have them do. And it really depends, and I've noticed this, when we decided to hire a media consultant, it was specific to issues that we see coming up, like the activist movement that Mr. Kelly has referred to several times, or other potential issues that we could have. But the media consultant is hired specifically to deal with what is presented to the public. And it should be on a case-by-case basis. If we develop a specific policy, then of course, once again, we're tying Mr. Kryman's hands and Mr. Grable's hands. And I kind of don't want to see that. If the adoption of what Mr. Kelly is saying can be toned down, and then I would be in agreement with it.
So, Linda, when's our next JOGC meeting?
I want to say, hold on, I'll check right now. I know it's not in August, either September or October. We'll check right now for you.
Okay. Okay, so the current motion on the table is to adopt some minor changes, which I'll provide to LACERA in writing, but I addressed verbally to the committee, in addition to directing staff to incorporate the consultant element of the policy and to move these items to both the Board of Retirement and Board of Investments. That is the current motion that is on the table. We also have an opportunity, if we want to bring this back as September 17th, so our next JOGC meeting, so we could bring it back to the JOGC to review one last time before we move to both boards. But the current motion is to move it directly to both boards.
I'm in agreement with that, Mr. Quijo, to bring it back just to see and review the language that the staff is going to draft with regards to the consultant. Again, to ensure that it doesn't tie the CEOs or the CIO ability. So I'm in favor of that, and I will incorporate that in the motion if need be.
Mr. Bernstein, you in agreement?
Absolutely.
Okay, perfect. I think that's the best bet, and then that way there's no rush on this policy. We make sure that it's done right when we put it through. Okay, so that is the motion on the table. If there are no further comments on the item, let's go ahead and do a roll call vote.
Okay, Mr. Santos?
Aye.
Thank you. Mr. Kelly?
Yes.
Thank you. Ms. Gray? Thank you. Ms. Greenwood?
Aye.
Thank you. Mr. Bernstein?
Aye.
Thank you. And Chair Kehoe?
Aye.
Thank you. The chair and the motion passes unanimously.
Thank you very much. That brings us to item B, which was renumbered to item C, which is a recommendation that the committee provide input to the Code of Ethical Conduct and make a recommendation as we deem appropriate. We have a memo dated July 12th, 2021. In that memo, there's a number of comments and staff notes on general comments on things that they were going to incorporate. We don't have a red line copy because I believe that we wanted to have an open discussion here in the committee. I don't have any particular items from there. I do know that we have the use of name element that's still pending. So I'll go ahead and open it up for discussion from any committee or board members regarding both the staff comments of additions and any thoughts on, in particular, on any items they'd like to incorporate. And I'll open it with Mr. Kelly.
Thank you. On page, I'm just going to go page by page. I have a lot of comments. On page 5, I'm sorry, on page 20 of 123, under the first bullet, under ethics and ethical conduct, it says first laws and regulations apply to LACERA. It lists various laws. I think we should include the Ralph M. Brown Act in this bullet because it's not currently included. On page 22 of 123, we should list in these bullets again compliance with the Ralph M. Brown Act. In the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, in the 8th bullet down, it says report to appropriate persons actions which may constitute violations of this code of ethical conduct. I thought we should make it very clear that we are to report actions even if the actions are of another person. And that's not clear in that bullet.
I'm sorry, I don't understand the actions of another person with.
Yeah, so if I see you, Vivian, violating the code of ethical conduct, I need to report that, even if I have not violated the code myself.
Oh, I see what you're saying. So you want to change the bullet from report to an appropriate person actions which may constitute violations of this code, and you want to change it to
Report to an appropriate person my own actions which may violate the code or the actions of others. I'm to report my own or actions of others if I'm aware of the actions of others.
okay.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, may I make a comment on this particular item?
Can I finish, please?
Yes. Oh,
Can I finish, please?
Yeah, so I was going to ask Mr. Kelly, would you like to
I would like to
have an
finish.
opportunity to have everybody address each correction as we go, or do you want to make a single?
Yeah, I'd rather finish.
Okay, then let's proceed like that. You have the floor.
Okay, on page 26 of 123, the second to last paragraph, it says these duties are also included in section 3159 of Searle. I wasn't sure that Searle had previously been defined, and it should be. On 27 of 123, under B, fiduciary duties of LACERA and staff's role. Here we refer to board members, and in other places, I think in this policy or some of the other policies on today's agenda, we refer to trustees, and I thought we should just pick one word and stay with it. Under C, fiduciary duties of certain vendors, we write here, certain vendors have a fiduciary duty. LACERA board members and staff shall be aware of those vendors that owe a fiduciary duty and monitor them. I don't know how we monitor the vendors with whom LACERA has contracts, not all of which, depending on the board that we're on, not all of which we would even have exposure to. So I think this responsibility belongs to contract compliance or contract monitoring and not to trustees. I think if it is here, it has to be more open, that if we become aware of an issue with the vendor, we're required to report it, but not that we actively monitor the vendors. That's very problematic to me because I don't think there's a mechanism in place to do that. On the following page, which would be page 28 of 123, on the first paragraph under A, I think the first and second paragraphs need to be flipped so that you provide a general introduction to the Political Reform Act prior to discussing the trustee responsibilities. I think that just flows better that way. In the third paragraph, there's also a separate conflict of interest code for those who serve as officers or hold other positions. What was my comment there? Is this separate conflict of interest code also approved by the BOR and BOI and then routed to the Board of Supervisors? That was not clear to me.
Yeah, the answer to that, just to interject if I might, is that that code is not approved by the LACERA boards because the title holding companies are independent entities, and there's a separation between LACERA and those entities. However, those codes are forwarded to the Board of Supervisors, just like LACERA's own separate code is forwarded to the Board of Supervisors.
Interesting. Okay. Under the following paragraph, I think you need to make clearer that section 87-200 filers can also be code filers and vice versa. And the county treasurer, in the same paragraph, the county treasurer, the ex officio trustee, is a section 87-200 filer, not only due to the treasurer's role, not only due to being the ex officio trustee, but also due to the treasurer's role in managing the county treasury pool. I thought that should be a footnote or something. So that has come up in the past. On the following page, page 29 of 123 under honoraria, I think you should note if this suggests that honoraria can only be cash, can only be in cash form. And I think you should clarify if honoraria can also be in non-cash form, because I think it can be.
It does say gifts.
On page 30 of 123, I think under the the second to last paragraph where you say LACERA board members and staff shall not engage in any employment activity or enterprise, which is inconsistent. LACERA board members and staff shall not perform any work, service, or counsel outside his or her responsibilities for LACERA. I think you should note here that the agency has a board-approved contract for collections with the treasurer tax collector, and that the treasurer tax collector recuses himself or herself from that. This suggests that would be illegal, and it's not, because the agency has a contract with the tax collector. You see, I think that was on page 34 of 123. I think here I didn't understand how we could monitor purchase orders. You say we are to have no contact with individuals or entities who are seeking engagement by LACERA in response to an RFP, RFI, purchase order, or other solicitation. We don't see, Ms. Himes doesn't publish, I don't think, I've not seen it, a list of pending purchase orders. So I don't know how we are to know what purchase orders LACERA either has or is interested in entering into that would allow us to monitor them. So I think that needs to be clarified, or we need to get the information to monitor. Let me see anything else. I think that's okay. I'm 30. This is 38. Down 38 of 123. On prospective employment, LACERA board members and all staff shall not participate in making or influence. This non-governmental provision. I thought, my comment is, I thought trustees had a 2-year period after they left the board before they could accept a position with the firm that did business with LACERA, and I don't see that here. So if that could be clarified, or maybe I'm wrong. On the following page, reporting. I think this section here, as well as the one I previously identified, I think we need to make it clearer that we are responsible for reporting ethical violations of others as well as ourselves, and that could be clarified there. And those were my comments. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. What I'd like to do is use that as the baseline for discussion. So let's use that as the baseline for discussion on any type of addition, changes, or revisions to any of your comments. I do have a few areas that I'd like to go back and address. So let's go ahead and proceed with that. And Mr. Santos, I know you had a question about one of those items, so I'll make sure to bring that up. The first item is on page 38. You had talked about the 2-year delay. Was that a let's ask Mr. Rice, is that a legal requirement, or that's something in Cyril?
Yes, there's
Or-
something there. There is a provision in Cyril that deals with revolving door, and there's also a provision in the Political Reform Act that applies to certain officials as well. So yes, that is correct. They're in statute.
Okay, so if we can incorporate those items into that section, that would be very helpful. So there's no confusion from anybody, any trustee. So yeah, so page 38, if you can incorporate those.
Mr. Kehoe.
Chair Kehoe, can you clarify something about that?
Yes.
If the reason to incorporate it into the policy is to reflect Cyril, then rather than hard coding what the dictate is, why not make it a reference to Cyril conditions so that if Cyril is changed, our policy changes automatically?
I wouldn't be opposed to that. So any statutory obligations in the, but we would have to direct staff that throughout the entire code of ethical conduct, any statutory obligations would then be referenced to the actual statute rather than incorporated specifically into the policy. Is that the direction?
If I may, Mr. Kehoe, and that's what I was going to say. That a lot of the suggested changes are part of statutes that it could be, we are obligated no matter what to follow the law. And specifically, like another question beyond that, we have on page 38 limitations on subsequent activities and make reference to the 2-year. So should not for 2 years after leaving the position for compensation. So that's already is a policy. So I don't understand what suggested changes should be made to that particular provision on page 38, subsection B. And also with regards to reporting of other activities, that's in the law, and that we are obligated legally to report any perceived violations of the law of the fiduciary duty in particular, because if we don't, we could, if I understand this correctly, the law, Mr. Rice, is that we could be liable because we will be somewhat acquiescent to that activities. We are mandated by law to report. So I'd agree with Mr. Bernstein that we should make reference to the particular statute addressing that, rather than enumerating all those prohibitions from the law, which is without. Thank you.
Thank you for those. I have a general comment and then a suggestion. I think how we can proceed with this. The general comment is I'm in agreement with Mr. Kelly's concerns about some of the obligations we have for RFPs, existing contracts, and existing relationships. And I've addressed that before in the past on the BOI because we do so much business with so many different people. And I remember going back a few years, me and Mr. Santos were at a conference, and Santos turned to me and said, "Hey, LACERA owns this building." And we were sitting in the hotel that we owned, and I had no clue that we owned the building. So those type of scenarios, sometimes you don't know. So I think there has to be a way that we can address that issue within the policy to say like, aware of, or that we have to do some sort of ongoing communication to trustees on existing open RFPs, et cetera, which I think is a lot more cumbersome and a lot more difficult. So we have to somehow address and craft that. So I think my suggestion would be, since we are going to bring that other policy back in September, how about we direct staff to incorporate Mr. Kelly's comments exclusive of the statutory obligations that we're going to reference rather than specifically address, and that we also direct staff to address those concerns raised about knowledge of what RFPs and contracts, and that staff incorporates their own comments that they had noted, some directions that they were going to go, craft it as a red line version and bring it back to the committee on September 19th. So
I will second the motion, Mr. Kehoe.
Perfect. Thank you. So I'll make the motion. It's been moved and seconded. That's the point of discussion that we're having. And I believe I have Mr. Rice, Mr. Kelly, and Ms. Sanchez. So let's go ahead and start with Mr. Rice.
Thank you. Just a perspective with respect to removing a description of statutory provisions. When this code was rewritten in 2016, there was additional information added to make it a clear piece of communication to staff as well as to trustees and also third parties for that matter, because this is posted on the website. And removing any of the descriptive information may make it actually harder to enforce, for example, in staff HR situations where we often, in fact, utilize the code is an important document setting standards of conduct, and also just from a communication point of view, it loses something if we have to rely on readers to flip back to or find even a statute or a regulation. So most of these principles are well-established principles in the law. There are certain things that change periodically, like we know the gift limit, for example, is going to change every 2 years. So we want to state the gift limit, but we also acknowledge that it changes. So that's going to have to be updated, and there may be things like the internal audit hotline that was created since 2016. We need to add references to that, but generally the statutes and the rules remain relatively unchanged, and the principles. So it's just a perspective that making statutory references opposed to providing the descriptive information, like the 2-year revolving door period, arguably weakens the document as a communication piece, and which then may have ramifications on enforcement.
Okay, thank you all. Comments are noted. Let's go ahead and proceed with the conversation, and then we can go back to that. Mr. Kelly, followed by Ms. Sanchez.
Yeah, thank you. I'm fine including statutory references when necessary, but I do agree with Mr. Rice that this is a document for its users. And if a user has to take the document and then in various instances go and search for statute to understand what the actual wording of the statute is really problematic to me and sets up an obstacle, if you will, for users to embrace the document. It's not unreasonable to do both, to include the statutory reference and a very short description of what the statutory reference refers to. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Sanchez.
Hi, yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I sure can.
Great. Apologies. I am passing a kidney stone, so I've been under the weather. Mr. Kehoe, I agree with you with regard to sort of knowledge of parties that we do business with, et cetera. And I obviously have to manage this very carefully with my own business and I'm constantly checking on these things. And one of the things that I had asked for a while back, actually, it's, I think going on 2 years ago, maybe, is that we regularly publish as part of communications with us and the CIO report, we now have a quiet period list. And so that helps us as trustees kind of be aware of who we are in quiet periods with. And that is very, very helpful. But I had asked for a regular and updated list of the entities that we do business with, almost similar to a prohibited list of companies, for example, at entities where people with certain access cannot make certain trades. It would be something similar, which is that as we add new entities to our to who we do business with, they be updated on, let's say, a quarterly basis, so that we have simply a document which is regularly shared, so that we don't have to guess or do research or et cetera, that it is just simply published as part of a list. That was my suggestion a long time ago, and I haven't seen a list except that the quiet periods have been added, and that has been very helpful. But I think a comprehensive list that is regularly updated should not be an overly burdensome task in order to help with communication.
Thank you. And that could definitely be incorporated in a SharePoint type website that we can access and have real-time information. I have Mr. Santos followed by Mr. Bernstein. Mr. Santos.
Yeah, I was going to mention the fact that the CIO already publishes a list of firms that are being evaluated by the staff. So that's the quiet firm. So my suggestion for the board of retirement, perhaps in the CEO report, he could publish a similar list involved in the retirement of the benefit side of the house, so that way we are aware of those vendors that we should stay away from during the quiet period. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Bernstein.
Thank you. I'm in support of all these things. I wanted to draw attention to Section X, political activities. I just wanted to raise for question. I understand the sort of inherent logic of why trustees should not be soliciting employees of LACERA for contributions, but I'm not as clear why we are banned from soliciting our peers. And I would note that unlike the city of Los Angeles, the county of Los Angeles does not create a sort of a protected class for appointees. We are allowed to be solicited. So I'm just not clear. There does seem to be a risk of undue pressure if we are asking employees to give money to campaigns, but it seems like a fairly normal operation that we might ask each other. I also just want to say, I don't totally understand the exception for ballot measures. There may be a reason for it, but I'm just curious why there's a carve out for that. But my greater concern is that I'm not sure I agree that it isn't fairly normal and reasonable for us to be asking each other to consider supporting candidates.
Mr. Rice.
This provision has been in the LACERA code for a long time. It was carried over in edited form in 2016 from the code that had been in effect for many years previously. It's an approach to depoliticize and minimize the risk associated with solicitation of contributions, and that's the explanation for it. I think it's a best practice to have a provision that's framed like this.
So, if I may, Chair Kehoe?
Yes.
The county, in their considered wisdom, does not consider it a best practice. They do not have a carve out for that. It may have been here a long time, but I'm not sure that makes it right. And it feels like a gotcha. I personally don't think we should be soliciting employees, but if Ms. Gray is excited about a candidate and wants me to consider supporting them, I'm perfectly capable of saying yes or no, and I'm not put off by the question. So I wanted to raise that.
Yeah, Chair Keo, if I might just add, I think this is a good question, and it makes me want to consult with fiduciary counsel, particularly the Karen Getman, a former FPPC chair, who's very on top of contribution issues and would be very much aware of best practices in this area. And she has not reviewed this, and also, of course, Ms. Dunning and Mr. Klausner, if they have comments as well. So to the extent this is going to come back, that's part of the homework that staff would take on.
I would be fine with that.
Mr. Chair.
Yes,
Chair.
so
Mr. Chair.
I have you, Mr. Kelly, in. Yes, Mr. Kelly, I have you in the queue. I just want to do one thing before we move over to you. The item in front of us is to adopt. Can you hear me? I just saw my internet settings. It was
Yes.
unstable. Okay, perfect. So what I would like to do as the motion maker is to incorporate Mr. Rice's comments about cross-referencing both the statutory obligations within the policy. So that would be a minor revision to the amendment to incorporate a majority of Mr. Kelly's comments as well, to incorporate Ms. Sanchez's comments about the addition of a specific list that we can reference, and to include Mr. Rice meeting with fiduciary counsel regarding the amendments to item X for political activities as suggested by Mr. Bernstein. So all of that would be incorporated if Mr. Santos would be in agreement with that.
No objection.
Okay, and now that's the topic for discussion, and I will move it on to you, Mr. Kelly, and I believe followed by Ms.
Thank you. I do think, Mr. Rice, that at a minimum, it would be prudent to think about carving out the ex officio trustee from political activities. And Mr. Bernstein, the reason for that is we did have a situation where a chief deputy supervisor, Ms. Barger, was running for office and her brother was on the Board of Investments. And I think it becomes problematic in those instances where there's that type of relationship for one to pursue a donation from another, particularly in that instance because at the time, the ex officio reported administratively to the 5th District Supervisor. So I think there needs to be particular focus on appreciating the complexity of the relationships among trustees and supervisors, particularly related to the ex officio trustee. Thank you.
Thank you for those comments. I believe Mr. Rice can look into those as he's proceeding with the legal analysis. And I have Ms. Gray.
Thank you. I have to get to the page number. Okay. I just have one question with respect to item 6. We haven't talked about that. We've always done it. And that's employment of related and unrelated persons. And it's just very dead drop to avoid nepotism or the appearance of nepotism. LACERA may not employ a person who's related to board members, CEO, or the AEO or division manager. I would ask that we add to that, subject to board approval. And the reason why is because we might be limiting ourselves to very highly qualified individuals who LACERA could benefit from, just because of the fact that they may be related to the aforementioned individuals. So I would just ask that, the board be able to say yay or nay to this, with possibly a recusal of the board member or other individual, who that person is related to, in terms of approving, you know, a relative to work for LACERA. And the reason why I say this is because, you know, there's another paragraph that says that, well, if the person was already working for LACERA, then it's okay. So I think that we're kind of limiting ourselves, and we're saying okay to one, but not okay to the other. So I think that the board should have some input into whether or not a person can be employed by LACERA if related to any of the individuals that are enumerated.
So Ms. Gray, if you're not opposed to it, we can direct staff as part of this motion to craft a, to look into that issue to make sure there's no, fiduciary concerns. And then if there is none, to craft language to allow the CEO to bring an employment to the boards with the particular trustee in question recusing themselves from the actual vote. So I don't know, there's a lot to that. So I think that we asked Mr. Rice to look into that, see if that is even possible. I don't know if we can force a trustee to recuse themselves, so that might become an issue. But regardless, I think we can direct you to look into that. And then on that same note, I just happened to notice the third bullet point down where it says persons serving as assistant executive officer. I think we should just clarify that to say any direct reports to the chief executive officer. That way, all direct reports to the CEO is inclusive of that. That's a separate issue. But if you're not opposed to that, and if Mr. Santos is not opposed to that friendly amendment, we will direct staff to look into that issue and to incorporate what they can and bring it back to us on our September meeting.
No objection.
I hear no objection. Okay.
Chair Keough.
Comment?
Yes. I have Mr. Rice
I'm in the queue
and
before
Mr.
Mr.
Kelly.
Rice.
Go ahead.
I'm in the queue before Mr. Rice.
Okay, Mr. Kelly, go ahead.
I would ask that Mr. Rice consider the impact of that to who becomes the employee's appointing authority. I think there could be issues there, and that's that you consider that in your analysis. Thank you.
And Mr. Rice?
My comment was just simply to clarify that in addition to fiduciary issues, we would also include HR issues, such as the issue that Mr. Kelly just raised. There are HR ramifications of, as well as fiduciary ramifications of weakening or broadening a nepotism provision.
Can I ask one other thing to be clarified by staff? The final bullet point, any member of the employee's household, whether or not related, would seem to suggest that a roommate would be disqualified for LACERA unemployment, which seems like an unusual position. If staff could just clarify that as well.
Yes.
Perfect. And I think we're all clear, we're not tying hands of staff as they look into this. So do a legal analysis, full analysis, and then bring it back if it is something. Personally, I'm not opposed to Mrs. Gray comment. I do think so. And I think that rather than it being appointed by the board, it would be simply just an authority of the board adopting the CEO's recommendation. And it would have to be a very specific case that the CEO is willing to bring forward to this board. But then we also need to weigh that with the concerns of, okay, are we doing undue pressure on the CEO for that? Because we still are the boss of the CEO, right? So there are some concerns on that. So I do want fiduciary counsel to review that and weigh in on it as they look at that policy. So I think we have a big ask of staff here, but I have full confidence that staff will be able to rewind and watch this committee meeting again to make sure they catch everything. Any additional comments or thoughts before we proceed with a vote? I see none, so let's go ahead and do a roll call vote with the motion.
Mr. Santos,
Aye.
Mr. Kelly,
Yes.
Ms. Gray,
Yes.
Ms. Greenwood,
Aye.
Mr. Bernstein,
Aye.
Chair Kehoe.
Aye.
Okay, the motion passes unanimously.
Thank you very much. That now brings us to our report, which is item 5A. I'm just going to do a test here with the board and committee. Is there any one that wants to take a break before we dive into this, or are we ready to jump right in? We're at the hour and 20 minute
Mr.
mark.
Kehoe, we have one more item for and for non-consent, the media.
Oh. Good catch. Good catch. Thank you, Linda. I totally missed that. So
You're
item
welcome.
D. Let's do item D, and then we'll do a short break, and then we'll jump into the report. So item D is a recommendation that we recommend to the boards to approve a senior media artist position. We have a memo dated July 11th, 2021. I think it was a very descriptive, and we probably don't need a staff presentation from that unless requested. So is there any thoughts, comments, or anything? I'll go ahead and proceed with a motion to adopt the staff recommendation.
So moved.
It's moved and seconded. I have Mr. Kelly, I have you with a comment.
Yeah, thank you. I'm not going to support this. And I've had an email exchange or two with Dr. Natoya in the past several days to discuss this. The reasons for this are, my reasons for this are the position description documents reporting relationships that are confusing and quite frankly call into question the value of the creative director. And if we have to end up going down the agency has to end up going down the performance management route with an employee, I think its success will be compromised by these very soft reporting relationships that are documented in the position description. As well, I didn't see any revisions to the senior writer position class spec. So we end up having two very different class specs for two positions that vary only by the nature of the product they produce, i.e. written or media. And that's problematic to me. The senior media position class spec includes a generic statement that the incumbent may direct supervised staff, which I think would be sufficient for the senior media class spec. So for these reasons, I'm not supporting the item.
Okay.
Thank you.
No recommendations for revisions. Okay.
To include my comments.
So we will open it up for any.
And if I may, Mr. Kehoe.
Yes, Ms. Saunders.
And in favor of staff recommendation. I just, my comment is that I would like to thank Dr. Natoya for including the specific numbers with regards to the salary. That's really important. I know in the past they have referenced the salary ordinance without specifically stating the dollar amount. So this is good, very clear. So I'm in support. Thank you.
Thank you. And Dr. Natoya, you're going to have to earn your money today. Can you reply to the comments raised by Mr. Kelly? I'm not privy to the email exchanges back and forth. So is there anything that you are recommending in light of your recent conversations to revise, or are you in support of the existing motions? If you could please bring that to our attention.
Sure, thank you. Good morning. Regarding Mr. Kelly's comment about the differences between senior writer and proposed senior media artist, and then writer 2 and media artist, the media artist position was the one that was studied. We have not had an opportunity to review the senior writer and writer 2, writer 1 positions. So to make a change on those class descriptions, whether it be clarification of the language, wouldn't be appropriate based on the media artist study. Reviewing the senior writer, writer 2, and writer are good notes for the future, and we can do that when we have the opportunity to review them. Regarding the reporting relationships, I understand the comment, and maybe the senior writer needs to be brought up to current language. The senior writer hasn't been reviewed since 2008, which is the last time media artist was reviewed. So we're making updates to the language, to descriptions, and how we put together our class descriptions to make them more clear. Generally, in orientation, we do a very good job of informing staff, new staff, promoted staff of what the reporting relationship is. And very generally, we tell them that your supervisor is the person who approves your time off and does your performance evaluation. So technical direction can come from anyone with technical knowledge, technical expertise, or even a stakeholder, right? But the supervision definitely comes from the designated bona fide supervisor.
I think that's very helpful. Ms. Gray?
Question, and I am in support of the motion to approve this.
Thank you. Okay, we have the motion on the table. It's been moved and seconded. Any additional comments? Hearing none, let's go ahead and please vote.
Mr. Santos,
Aye.
Mr. Kelly,
No.
Ms. Gray,
Aye.
Ms. Greenwood,
Aye.
Mr. Bernstein,
Aye.
Chair Kehoe.
Aye.
Okay, the motion passes with 4 yeses and 5 yeses and 1 no.
Perfect. And just for clarification purposes, the senior writer position is going to be analyzed and brought back, correct?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
So I'm sorry,
Okay.
Chair Kehoe, before we
Yes.
move on, I'd just like to thank our partners at SEIU and County Class and Comp for their feedback about the class descriptions.
Thank you very much. Okay, so let's go ahead and do a short break. We'll come back at 9:35. 9:35, we will proceed with our report about the trustee employment and healthcare issues. Thank you. If trustees can reappear, we'll make sure that we got a quorum here.
Going to be able to keep
I'm
up.
here.
Even Skyfox.
Yeah, I believe we do have a quorum now, so let's go ahead and proceed with our report. Although this is a report, obviously the committee retains the ability to make recommendations on it. The report is for discussion of a confidential memo that we did receive. It's a legal document regarding trustees as employees and trustee healthcare issues. I do have questions on it. I'm sure that other trustees do as well, but this one I would like to pass on to staff. I'll go ahead and turn it to you, Mr. Rice, if you can do a brief introduction, and then turn it over to any of our good consultants or fiduciary counsel on anything that they need to comment on. So, Mr. Rice.
Thank you. By way of brief introduction, I wanted to emphasize, as Chair Kehoe already did, that the memo on this item is privileged. The Brown Act permits us to provide the memo as a privileged document as opposed to part of the public packet, because the document is protected from disclosure under the Public Records Act. That doesn't prevent us from having a discussion and having the questions answered. We would ask that to the extent possible, citations to pages in the memo or specific language in the memo be avoided, because we don't want to waive the privilege. Bob and Ashley will draw lines where they think is appropriate, but we can have a full discussion of this item. I just simply wanted to make that reminder. This issue has been around for a long time. Staff did a memo on it back in 2020, I believe, which was presented to both boards. It was a comprehensive memo. However, there was a desire to have the issue reviewed from scratch. So current fiduciary council have done that. They have reviewed the issue from scratch without the direction in any way, shape, or form of council here at LACERA, and without being bound in any way by prior opinions on the issue. So the work they're going to share is their own, and the conclusions they've reached are their own, and they're not. They've been specifically instructed and have taken the instruction seriously to be completely independent as fiduciary counsel to the boards in advising on this issue. And with that, I'll pass it over to Bob and Ashley. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Kehoe, with your permission. Okay, I don't hear. There you go. This is, I always like to start with the answer because I think that's what you want. And I think the most important thing today is to get your questions answered. Our appointed trustees of LACERA, are they employees or not? And the answer is they are not employees. Are you eligible for compensation? And that would include benefits other than what's specifically provided for in SERL. Without a change in the law, I believe the answer is no. And I want you to know that Ashley Dunning and I actually worked independently in the beginning. We took your questions and then we went off and worked on our own so that each of us would not influence the thinking of the other. And when we put our thoughts together, we were on the same, we had reached the same conclusions. The board is a collegial body. Individual trustees are part of the whole. You're public officers and you're neither employees nor contractors, but your authority is exercised in a collegial fashion. And it was designed that way statutorily. And you don't report to anybody except yourself and except your own conscience and as you participate as a trustee. And you had a thought come up a moment ago about can a trustee force another trustee to recuse themselves? Can you raise the issue? Yes. Can you force that person to make the decision? No. And that has a lot to do with your status as an officer. The board acting collectively is really more akin to an employer than it is to anything else, because you hire the CEO and the COO and the chief counsel and the chief investment officer. From there, hiring goes down as you delegated it to the people that report directly to you. And those are the employees of LACERA, including from the CEO down. You're not employees, you're the boss. And as you act collegially. Now, we looked at a variety of statutory and common law issues. We looked at, and I wrote it down because I wanted to remember it. We looked at the California Labor Code. We looked at, in no particular order. We looked at the California Labor Code. We looked at SERL. We looked at Article 16 of the state constitution. We looked at federal employment statutes. We looked at the Affordable Care Act. We looked at the county code, including the civil service provisions, the wage and hour law, the workers' compensation law, the unemployment compensation law, and all of the cases that have emanated, not all of them, a substantial number of cases that have emanated from those statutes interpreting them. And that still led us to the conclusion where we are. And as it relates to how you are recompensed for your service as a trustee, well, obviously we have active employees who are receiving their regular pay from their respective jobs with the county. For those of you who are appointed, and that would include in my mind the retired folks who are elected by their constituency because they're not they're not active employees of the county. But they do receive a retirement benefit from LACERA, and that would include some healthcare subsidy. And I think Searle's pretty specific, and just one overarching rule of statutory construction. When the legislature gives you a list of things that are included and they don't mention anything else, the general rule is those non-mentioned things were intentionally excluded. And Searle's pretty specific about the stipend you get for meetings and the stipends, the difference in the stipend for disability, and also you're reimbursed for your expenses in the performance of your LACERA board member duties. And that's really a summary of what we spent a lot of time studying. And I'd like to turn it over to Ashley now, who really, I think can unwrap all of the specifics of these statutes and their sometimes nonsensical interrelationship, because how can I be one thing in one law and not in the other? And Ashley, if you would take it from here, please. And of course, we're both available to answer your questions.
Thank you, Bob, and good morning, members of the boards. Can you hear me well? Good. As Bob noted, we've analyzed a lot of different statutes and cases and legal principles to reach the conclusions that we've shared with you. Two overarching California law-based principles, though, I think really warrant particular focus, and that is the California legislature has defined how people come to the boards of LACERA. Whether you're elected as an active member of the system, you're elected based on your status as a retiree member of the system, or you're appointed because you are not connected in any capacity to county government at the time that you are sitting in an appointed position. And that structure is deliberate to have the consequence of the appointment of a member be that they thereby become an employee either of LACERA. It is not consistent with that statutory structure. The individual remains, as an appointee, remains unconnected to county government in any capacity, and is not a LACERA employee. With respect to the compensation topic, the Searle is equally straightforward. And as to LACERA specifically, the county of the first class, there's a statute. It's 31521.1 with respect to the stipend that may not be more than $100 per meeting and no more than 5 meetings per month for both the appointed and the elected retiree member. There's a separate provision that allows for payment for time that you spend reviewing disability retirement packets for people on the retirement board. And then there's reimbursement for your actual and necessary expenses, and that's statutorily provided for. But as Bob noted, the fact that the statute provides thou shalt not be compensated more than X amount is to be interpreted and applied in a restrictive manner. And compensation is therefore not permitted in excess of those amounts. The topic sometimes arises about the fact that a determination of what's a necessary expense incurred as the result of one's participation on the boards necessarily involves some subjectivity. and necessarily involves variations of what is expended by different trustees in the course of engaging in their responsibilities. But that too is addressed by California law, and it specifically permits the board and to reimburse its members for those expenses, both under the SERL provisions and California conflict of interest law. So that big picture is the basis for our conclusions. As noted, we have analyzed a lot of different statutory frameworks under which topics like healthcare are addressed. And we are available to respond to questions should you have specific ones on them. But I will stop my introductory comments there, and I'm happy to respond to any questions you may have.
Thank you. So right now I have Ms. Greenwood followed by Mr. Kelly. Ms. Greenwood.
Thank you very much. Thank you all thank you both for doing this work. I very much appreciate it. I have kind of an unusual question that comes from this, and I suspect I know the answer, but I want to ask it anyway. If a trustee wished to buy into one of the county healthcare plans, could we or could the County Board of Supervisors tweak the law so that a trustee were allowed to do that?
Ms. Nossman?
I think the answer is that would be up to the county. The only problematic thing would be is if the trustee who is buying in asked LACERA to pay the freight, because then you get into essentially seeking compensation in excess of that which the legislature mandated. The county runs its own healthcare program. That's really external, in my view, to what's in SERL. So I think that's kind of I think that's their call. I know there are hundreds of county boards. Not all are statutorily created like this one. But since it is their program, they'd be the one to set the rule.
Okay, that's actually good news to me. I don't need it, but I suspect that others may, that found in the county plan, because the pool of employees is so large, is going to be a more comprehensive healthcare coverage at a lesser price. So if people were able to buy into that, it could be an additional benefit, even if LACERA or any other board that someone sat on wasn't providing the payment. Thank you very much.
If I might add to that, Trustee Greenwood, just briefly, the way you framed your question, I think creates a couple subparts to the question, because you said, could we or the county tweak the law to permit that? If the answer is, could LACERA tweak the law to permit that? The answer is no, and that's what we've addressed. If the question is, could the county tweak the law? The answer there too is no, the county can't change the statutes that apply. That would be the legislature's job. However, if your question is, could the county tweak its healthcare plan so as to permit those whom it appoints to boards such as LACERA's board to participate in their plan? That's a question for the county.
Agree. I concur with Ashley's analysis.
Thank you very much for negotiating my oddly worded question.
Thank you. Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Kelly, you're muted. We can't hear you.
Okay, thank you. I do think the population of elected trustees needs to be differentiated from appointed in your memo, and it was not, and I think that needs to be done. because they are different populations. There was also an error regarding the taxes withheld that I routed to Mr. Rice, so he'll get that to you if he hasn't already. And then to follow up on Ms. Greenwood's question, which was mine, if the county, LACERA doesn't procure its own health benefits, those are procured through Mother County, and it leverages off of Mother County's plans. So if the definition of employee in those plan documents today covered LACERA appointed trustees, would the trustees availing themselves of those plans present a 1090 conflict for the trustee?
Ashley, you're
Sorry,
muted.
I was muted, sorry. Maybe I'll take this one first, in reverse order. So if your question, what Trustee Kelly was, if the county's healthcare plan already permitted those whom it appoints to various boards to participate, would a trustee availing itself of that already provided plan create a 1090 conflict? I think the answer is no to that, because the trustee is not influencing a decision by a public official or a board to give themselves a special benefit. You're just availing yourself of a benefit that's already been provided on the same terms to similarly situated individuals.
Okay, and then to follow up on Ms. Greenwood's question, if the trustee was to request that the county board expand the definition to include trustees, would that invoke a 1090 conflict?
The 1090 addresses the context where somebody on a board is acting in their is acting to influence the actions of that board with respect to their own personal financial interests. And the scenario that you've described, Trustee Kelly, is where that trustee is seeking to influence a different board, the Board of Supervisors. So assuming that the appointed trustee does not sit on the Board of Supervisors, there wouldn't be that 1090 conflict, because they're not implicating an action of the LACERA board. They're asking for an action by the county board. So sitting right here, I don't see that conflict relating to that type of interaction, as long as it's not asking LACERA to take that influential role of asking for that action.
I concur in that, Trustee Kelly, and that kind of gets back to my earlier answer to Trustee Greenwood, which was it's up to the county to set the terms of its plan.
Understood. And just to be clear, as no part of this exercise, did you review the definition of eligibility for the county's plans to determine if in fact appointed trustees met that definition?
No, we did not review. I did not review the county retirement plan. We did review the Affordable Care Act, which doesn't require the provision of healthcare under these circumstances. But no, we did not review. That would be the county's responsibility. I did want to very briefly respond to your first observation, though, Trustee Kelly, which is that the analysis that we've been asked to provide related to the appointed trustee as opposed to, say, the elected retired trustee, and that's right. That has been the focus of our work. I'd say that the introductory comments that Bob made and that frame our analysis, though, with respect to the role that all board members play as more akin to that of an employer as opposed to an employee, applies equally to the elected retiree.
Okay. And then my final question is, you opine that the appointed are not employees, but you don't opine that they are by default independent contractors. And one of the issues, and maybe this is perhaps a separate legal question that we put out through Mr. Rice's office, one of the questions I grapple with is the county, as you noted, has taken a number of administrative steps that on their face classify those who are getting paid through CERL as employees. And I recently encountered another obstacle related to that, which is as a retired person elected, I wanted to buy myself a new car for my birthday. And I went to effect a withdrawal from my deferred compensation plan to pay for it. And I was denied the withdrawal because the third-party administrator for the county said I was an active employee. And they said that because I'm on the county's item control as a commissioner with my old employee number because I previously worked for the county. So that's another example, and you list several others in your memorandum that lead one to conclude, based on just administrative processes and protocols in themselves, that I'm an employee. But you don't opine that I'm an independent contractor. And the reason I mention that is, as an independent contractor, I'm required to file self-employment taxes with the IRS. So that may have been outside the scope of your charge, but I do think, Mr. Rice, we need an opinion about that because it's important that we comply with the law. And I'm not so sure, I speak just for myself, I'm not so sure that I am complying with the law from a tax perspective. Those are my questions and comments.
Mr. Kelly, this letter was not intended to provide tax advice, but it is our understanding, or certainly it's my understanding, that the rationale for your being provided a W-2 rather than a 1099 derives from tax law and a tax law analysis that led to that conclusion. Bob, did you want to address the independent contractor versus employee question?
Yeah, and I would, please, and through the chair to Trustee Kelly. You know, when you look at the labor code, well, California's courts have been very busy deciding who's an employee and who's a contractor of late.
Of the voters.
Yeah, and the voters, because they're trying to decide, am I your employee for wage and hour, or am I a contractor? Am I your employee for unemployment comp or workers' comp or whatever? And I think the analysis there, if you look at the labor code, which actually it's one of the few state labor code provisions I've seen that actually specifically incorporates decisions of the courts of the state, which we know could change later. But if you look at the ABC test, which is outlined in 2775 of the labor code, and that's discussed in Dynamex case and the Borello case and the Uber case, and from my reading, lots and lots of other cases that decided to have some nuance to those three. I think what makes you not a contractor is B. Now, certainly you're free from the control of the hiring entity. So if the hiring entity for you, well, actually you're appointed by you particularly are appointed by a specific constituency who elected you. The active members are elected from their various constituencies, and then there's an ex officio, and then there's the other appointees by the Board of Supervisors. So arguably you could say, well, there's a lot of hiring folks here. You know, there's a lot of hiring entities. If you're saying that you work for LACERA, they're not the ones who direct and control you. That's A. B, and what really influenced my thinking on this, is it says the person performs work that is outside, I've got it up on the screen, that is outside the usual course of the hiring entity's business. But it isn't. Your work is for LACERA. And you're customarily, it says number 3, engaged in an independently established trade. But that's the trade for which you're, quote, hired to do the work for the hiring entity in your capacity as a contractor. I think the best example of a contractor is Ashley and me. We are engaged in a regular trade, and you give us assignments, but you don't tell us how to do it. And we provide our own tools and our own offices and it is, while what we do exclusively for you is in your line of business, but what we do with our other clients is outside the usual trade of LACERA. It's certainly similar because we're pension lawyers. But I think if you break down that definition, and by the way, Ashley and I have no problem adding a section to this memo or an addendum to the memo that more clearly analyzes that, or more specifically analyzes that. But that's where I believe, and Ashley can certainly speak for herself, but in our conversations, this is where we came down to the fact that you, as part of the greater whole, and this is one of those instances where the whole is definitely greater than the sum of the parts, because that's what has the power, is that you're not a contractor. So I hope that answered your question.
In addition to Bob's analysis or run through of the ABC test, there's even a threshold question to consider before that, which is whether that test even could reasonably be applied in the context of the relationship we're talking about here, which is an appointed, or in the case of Trustee Kelly, an elected retiree member of a public retirement board. It may well be deemed not to have any applicability. I don't think California law is clear on that. The courts have been busy in this area, but not with respect to this particular topic.
Mr. Rice, I do think.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I do think, excuse me, I think we do need Mr. Rice and a tax opinion on this, because I certainly don't want to, I want to comply with the rules, but I don't know what the rules are.
Thank you. So I have that on my personal notes here to ask that we direct staff to do a tax analysis on it, specific to trustees in general, appointed, elected. I think that is within the purview of this board to do. In general, I think it's good guidance to provide to our members on that. And I know we don't want to get into specific tax situations, but I think a general analysis would be acceptable. I do have questions regarding this. So the 1090 section. So what I'm reading here is that a trustee can't vote on anything that would be a benefit, such as like a healthcare benefit. Yet many elected officials do that. I know of many city councils that have benefits, city council members, even as part-time city council members that aren't active employees, yet they voted to accept that. And that wasn't a 1090 violation. I know many elected officials are vote on the general raising of the board's salary or elected positions salaries. And I'm curious why this board would not be able to elect to do something like that, or to vote on something like that. I know that there's, the employment issue is still something out there, but specific to the benefits, like the retiree healthcare benefit, or not retiree healthcare, but active employee benefits, why that would be a 1090 violation when other elected bodies are able to do that. So can you address that? Because I'm confused there.
So after the Lexon versus Superior Court decision came down from the California Supreme Court, a lot more parameters were put around decisions such as those that Chair Kehoe, you've noted. I'm not going to opine on whether anybody else has violated 1090 or not. But what the Supreme Court said is, if you as a board are acting, you as a public entity board are acting upon a benefit in that changes your compensation, your own compensation, then you are not, you do not fall within the governmental salary exception to 1090. That's different from the Political Reform Act provision. That was a big surprise when that came down, because I think a lot of people did think that the rules were the same under 1090 and the Political Reform Act with respect to governmental salary. The reason why the trustees of the Public Retirement Board, whose trustees were the defendants in that case, all but one of them were not prosecuted as a result of that decision, is because the action that they were taking that was challenged was on a benefit that was provided, part of the public services generally provided by the board. It related to their retirement benefits, not their compensation. So in a Public Retirement Board context, that supports the conclusion that the retirement board can act on things like setting a discount rate, which changes the active employee rate at which they pay member contributions. And that does not create a conflict of interest. And in the case of the Lexon circumstance, the allegation was the actions of the board changed the retirement formulas for which people were eligible. That too was not a 1090 violation because it applied to everyone in the same manner. But as to the union president benefit that was at issue in that case as well, the court said that does create a potential 1090 violation because the group that was impacted by that benefit was too small to be eligible for the public services generally provided exception. So I don't know, I'm not going to opine on how boards of supervisors or city councils or other public entities like that act with respect to their own benefits. But what I can say is to public retirement boards and what the California Supreme Court has said on this is if you're acting on a benefit where it's impacting you differently from others, and it's a very small group of people where you're exercising your discretion in a manner which changes the compensation that's being provided, that can walk somebody right into a 1090 conflict.
And we do have the ability, if that was a direction that we went, we do have the ability to seek an analysis from the Attorney General prior to proceeding with that to make sure that we're checking everything. Or I don't know that I do know, like for Form 700 issues, that as long as you reach out to them and you get confirmation that it's not a violation, you have that in writing, you're protected. I don't know if you have that same level of protection if we did address something like that directly with the Attorney General or along that line.
So the FPPC does now advise on 1090 issues as well, although they always send those letters to the Attorney General for comment. So there are FPPC advice letters, there are Attorney General letters. The retirement system doesn't have somebody on the board who can ask for an Attorney General opinion, I don't believe, but you could ask for an FPPC advice letter.
Aren't you bound by the result of that letter?
It's not that you're bound, well,
The request.
question is whether you're protected by it.
Right.
And typically you are protected by it if you have asked the question and you are the one who is prosecuted.
Okay.
It doesn't protect other people
Right.
who may want to rely on that opinion.
So in that regard, it's like a private letter ruling from the IRS.
Correct.
They're instructive, but they don't offer shelter.
Correct. And the courts don't defer. They give deference to them, but they don't necessarily adopt whatever the FPPC says, because so the court may disagree. But just like a private letter ruling, you have some protection.
Okay, thank you. I will admit that doesn't clarify my thoughts, because I know I've sat through hundreds of city council meetings in those particular things, and I've seen them actively discussing and voting on these, and it just seems like it's being treated differently with us. But I do understand your opinion on that, and we do reserve the right, if that's the direction that we want to go, to try and seek some clarification with that. But I'll leave it at that. I know Mr. Rice had some comments as well. You're muted.
Yeah, excuse me. The only I had a comment actually on not this issue, but the prior comment about supplementing the addendum with, or the memo with respect to the tax analysis as to withholding and so forth. The county makes those decisions. In fact, because they issue the paychecks, they've actually been through IRS review, and we could do our own analysis and pass it along to them, whether they would take it or not, given that they've been through audit on this. I don't know, but I just want to simply make that point, that it's the county who issues those checks and decides whether it's a W-2 or a 1090, whether it's and what the categories of withholding are.
I definitely think we should do our own analysis on that, and we can always have a dialogue with the county if there is something different. I think it's ridiculous that Mr. Kelly can't withdraw money from his 457 or 401k. I mean, this whole conversation here is that he's considered not an employee, and yet the employer is telling him that he is an employee. So I think that's something that we do need to address, and then I think some general tax related questions on that. So I still think that's something that we direct staff to do. I have Mr. Bernstein in the queue, followed by Mr. Kelly.
Thank you, Chair Kehoe. I've scribbled a couple of questions, and I'm not sure what order they'll come out in. I just wanted to start off by acknowledging, sort of with the tax question, it may have been requisite that this be presented to us as an item that we couldn't discuss, but there are sort of employment law questions here. There are questions about the workload that I don't think Cyril anticipated for Class 1 county trustees that we couldn't address. It's a little closed loop, this conversation, for my taste. I'm glad that we're getting tax advice, but some of the broader employment questions, to me, I wish I could have gotten a little bit of outside input, and obviously that wasn't permitted under this agendizing. I'm pushing back, I guess, on this. The history of our system is that general employed members didn't get their salary for doing this until that was changed, I believe. And similarly, we didn't get money for reading cases until we did. So I think I want to ask, some of this presentation made it sound like that is always how it's been, but actually, wouldn't it be more accurate to describe our system as evolving over the decades?
Are you asking us?
Yeah.
Through the chair, the answer is yes. And that's what happens with statutory boards, that somebody sees something's missing. That's why I think a good example, I think, was the addition of the cost of living provision on the disability. One thing that I think is important, and I know Ashley can speak for herself on this, but for me, I think you should get paid, but that's a political question. That's not a legal question. Do I think your workload is tremendous? Yeah. I look at the other couple of hundred pension funds that we deal with in the country, and the workload that's on these two boards of trustees, the BOR and the BOI, is extraordinary by comparison to others. And is the recompense fair or equitable? Again, that's for the legislature to decide. But that doesn't change, at least in this lawyer's view, it doesn't change our interpretation of the statute. And I think you'll see throughout jurisprudence that courts will say, look, we don't judge the wisdom of legislation. That's for the legislature to do, and it's for the voters to judge the wisdom of the people who did the legislating. So I think that's more of a political question, at least to me, than a legal one. And Ashley may have her own view on that.
No, I'm sorry.
No, please go on.
Thank you. I agree with those comments. Both that this is squarely within the legislature's authority to approve or not to approve, and that the law does evolve, both through statutory changes and through judicial interpretation of statutes. My observation as to the way the courts have looked at Searle and other public retirement statutes of late is that they tend to give quite a bit of deference to the legislature and basically say you're stuck with the plan as the legislature designed it. Which means that to the extent that efforts are that one wants to make an effort to evolve the plan, the best course of action is through the legislature, as opposed to sort of pushing the envelope, if you will, through actions of the board to do things that are not within that legislative construct.
Actually, I'm confused. Perhaps you can expand on what you said. You said the legislator's default tends to be that this is how it's created. But I do believe, for instance, at one point, there was what strikes me as a very smart decision to allow employed workers to collect salary for the time they were putting into serving the fund. So they didn't default to this is how it was. They did evolve. Is that correct? Did I misunderstand?
Maybe I misspoke. What I meant to say was that the courts are deferring to the legislature. So yes, the legislature does evolve. And I think actually a great example of that, and I think this is what Bob said, but I'm not positive because he mentioned a COLA. There's a unique provision for LACERA that relates to the Board of Retirement members' review of disability retirement packets. That doesn't apply to any other Searle system of which I'm aware. And that clearly shows that there was an effort made somewhere to make sure that the LACERA Board of Retirement trustees are duly compensated for all the time that you spend on the tremendous number of disability retirement applications that come before that board. So yes, the legislature did respond on that one.
I will be both questioning and editorializing. I would note, when you call it duly compensated, the members of my board on the Board of Retirement who are paid for their reading are paid a sub-minimum wage hourly rate. They are compensated. I would question whether calling it duly compensated is correct, but to get
Fair enough.
To get back to this, the analysis seems to look strongly at appointed trustees. And I guess from an equity point of view, what concerns me is that we have trustees who arrive in very different ways with exactly the same mandate. And if anything, the solution crafted to me should be for all trustees. All trustees, in my opinion, and I agree with Bob, should be compensated. If the mechanism of allowing people to collect their salaries covers it, that's great. But I'm not clear why a solution has to be divide, because I think one of the unintended consequences of dividing is we wind up with sort of a divide and conquer situation. I am asking why there couldn't be an equitable proposal moved forward for all trustees, and for those who are already taken care of, great. But and to latch onto Mr. Kelly's comments, we are absolutely employed. I appreciate all the good work, but we get W-2s, we have employee numbers. There's no plain takeaway where all trustees of LACERA are not, to some degree, employees.
Chair Kehoe, can I add to the response?
Yes, please do.
Trustee Bernstein, I think one of the things we mentioned very briefly is that you could be treated as an employee under one statute and not under another. And under Trustee Kelly's analysis, you could be seen as a contractor in another. And when we were preparing for this earlier in the week, the conclusion was the way that all of these statutes fit together fits into Dickens' recitation that if that be the law, then the law is an ass. And a lot of times the law is an ass, and it doesn't, but, and this is the big but, the fix is in Sacramento. It's not in Los Angeles. The question that Ms. Greenwood asked is, can the county do something about the health insurance if it wants to? It's a call. But in terms of the recompense that trustees receive, that's just not something that's within your control. And what Ashley was referring to when she said there's a lot of deference to the legislature, or that you kind of get the plan you're dealt. In California, and this has been the country's been watching because of the influence of the California rule on the interpretation of rights to a retirement benefit, and that increasingly the courts are narrowing the scope of what's included within what's a guaranteed pension benefit. And even to the point where 2 of the district courts of appeal said, hey, maybe you're just entitled to a reasonable pension, not even the one you earned. So, is it evolving? Yeah, it's evolving. It has evolved over time, but the evolutionary process that matters for the issues that have been raised here seems to be legislative.
So if I may, Chair Kehoe, and I don't have a motion yet, but what I'm hearing from our council and from staff is that we can't solve this problem. But to me, the conversation is not whether we can solve it, it's how we solve it. It seems an untenable situation. I would note, to go back to Mr. Rice's introductory comments, this didn't rise in 2020. This has been going on for 30 years. Our former colleague, Mr. Muir, when he sat in Mr. Rice's seat, worked on this issue. This is not going away. We can push it for 40 years, but I want to say that it is, of course, for all of us, an honor to serve here. But Cyril did not anticipate that a position like mine would require 150 or more hours a month of service. And that's not even counting in the hours that one has to put in to be a chair. I think this is an untenable situation. And I wish that we had been presented this, and maybe we couldn't be, in a form that would have allowed broader input so that we could begin to craft a solution. I am a very fortunate person. I can afford to volunteer my time to the pension fund in this way, but we have vastly limited the number of people who can be appointed or perhaps even elected, although I think retirees generally are going to have pensions, which will in fact offset. You shouldn't have to have independent resources to be an appointed trustee, and that is the system. The other flip side, I'll say, because I want to wrap up and let other people speak, is if we can't do that, or if we won't do that, I think we need to look at the workload of the trustees. I think we need to question, should trustees be putting in this amount of time in a system, and is there a way of radically reducing the amount of time retired if we can't ethically compensate people for the work that they're doing? That's it.
Thank you. I have Mr. Kelly in the queue, and then I have a follow-up question. Mr.
Yeah,
Kelly.
I just wanted to confirm. I don't know if we need a motion or not, but I do think we need a tax analysis, and I appreciate Mr. Rice's comments that the county is led in this area, but I do think we need to obtain an independent analysis, as Mr. Kehoe suggested, present that to Mother County and dialogue about it. And so I just want to make sure that's going to occur. Is that your understanding, Mr. Rice? Or do we need a motion?
There's been no direction on that at this point. I'm
Okay.
anticipating that there may be some direction forthcoming.
Yeah, I apologize because I thought that was direction of staff. So let me just make it clear that that we're without objection from this committee. I'd like to direct staff to analyze the tax issues brought up in this committee meeting and bring it back to the committee for discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Perfect. And then I do have a question, and then I know I have Ms. Gray as well. Back on the 1090 issue and the healthcare related issue, assuming if we ruled out the 1090 issue, so say we went to the commission and they came back and said, no, you can go ahead and do this. It's a broad discussion about multiple, trustees, and we don't think that it's a 1090 violation. So big assumption, but assuming that that's what it is there other barriers to the healthcare to appointed trustees issue? Is it just simply that we legislatively do not have the authority to do that? So if you understand my question, I'm asking, it's a two-part. So if we do have the legislative authority to do it, then I would like to potentially seek a legal analysis from the authority. But if we just simply don't have the legal authority to do that without legislative change, then it's a non-issue. It's a moot point.
Yeah, I understand your question. Chair Kehoe, if there were no 1090 concern, then the question would come down to whether the SERL and other applicable law permits you to grant yourself a benefit in addition to what SERL provides. I still think there's a statutory problem for the reasons we've described, that the statute says thou shalt receive no more than X amount per board meeting for X number of board meetings, plus reasonable and necessary expenses. And I don't think that that healthcare reasonably falls within reasonable and necessary expenses that arise as a result of being on the boards. So I think as we've said a couple of times here, the political venue, in other words, legislative, through a legislative amendment to SERL, whether applicable only to the county of the first class or across the board, would be the way to proceed.
Okay, thank you for that, Ms. Gray.
Thank you. Just so I'm clear, I read through this memo, which was very, very well written with respect to the issue. And then we went on to taxation and medical coverage. But I want to delineate, for my understanding and clarity, if an appointed trustee is asking to be considered an employee of LACERA, an employee of LACERA, which ultimately would be an employee of the county, then my question is, number one, does that violate civil service law? Where you have to go through a process as opposed to being appointed, number one. Number two, then does that make appointed trustees eligible for all of the benefits of government employment, not just medical coverage, but 401k, deferred comp, the matching, retirement? It just changes the whole face of it all. Number three, my question is, and this goes to the narrow question with respect to medical coverage. In performing the work as an appointed trustee when we travel, or particularly if you're out of the country, if you incur certain medical issues or you're injured, can those particular things be addressed through our travel policy and reimbursements for travel expenses, as opposed to saying, okay, we're going to give appointed trustees medical coverage. Okay, so there's another avenue to address a potential issue that could arise as an appointed trustee. Let me see. I think that was it. Oh, and with respect to taxation, you know, that is an area where I am not proficient in. I hate taxation. I didn't take it in law school, and so I don't know. My question is, what issues are we raising here with respect to taxation? Is it with respect to giving our appointed trustees a W-2 form, a 1099? Mr. Kelly brought up certain issues, and I just wasn't quite clear on that. So those are my questions, and it's only for clarity.
And Ms. Gray, you bring up a really good
I
point
guess
about
I could call on Ash. Oh, and one other
Go ahead.
about
Ms. Gray, you had one additional question.
Sean, I missed you.
I was going to make a comment, but it sounds like you had an
Did I
additional question.
freeze? Ah. Oh, we,
Ms. Gray, you there?
yes. Go ahead, Sean. What was that?
You had one additional question?
I do, and that was to Ashley. I know that you said that it would be inappropriate for LACERA to try to tweak legislation with respect to how we deal with our appointed trustees. And then I was going to ask earlier, well, Ashley, is that an issue for SACers to propose? However, I already know what the answer is, because I already know how systems would react to that, and it would be in the negative because of the cost of the systems. I mean, we just can't do it, particularly under SURL. So, I mean, it just wouldn't happen. But my other questions, I need clarity on.
Thank you. And Ms. Gray, I was just going to comment that you brought up a really good point that I think we need to direct staff to look into, is the insurance issue for travel. I do know for international travel, we have a policy to provide a executive travel insurance to our trustees, which does cover healthcare related expenses, but that's not extended for domestic travel. So perhaps that is something that we look into, because we do know that somebody on a business trip for LACERA is going to be on a business trip for LACERA, and if it's an appointed trustee, at least they would have coverage during that time frame. And I believe that that would be an acceptable issue to look into. So if there's no objection, I'd like to direct staff to look into that in regards to how we apply that at the travel policy, and perhaps extend that to all trustees on all travel for domestic and international. So if there's no objection, we'll go ahead and I think address that issue there, Ms. Gray. But you had additional questions, and I'll go ahead and pass that over to Ms. Dunning or Mr. Klausner.
I can take a first crack at it. There was a lot packed in there, Trustee Gray, so I'll do my best. I think your first question was whether the question of having appointed trustees become eligible for LACERA employment, which you then said would essentially make them county employees, violate civil service or other county rules relating to the appointment of employees. And I think that's a really thoughtful question, and it relates to a topic that we noted, which is that LACERA, those who serve LACERA at LACERA are by statute county employees. And And while they serve LACERA and in that capacity or act as though they are LACERA employees and for purposes of hiring and evaluating and firing and all that sort of thing for your senior level employees, it's the LACERA boards who make those determinations. They remain for certain purposes county employees. And so yes, there would be a question to the county. The county may would have a different view, would have a view on whether those whom they're appointing, presumably would have a view on whether those whom they're appointing to all these various different boards, including LACERA's boards, are their employees or not. And my understanding is that question's been asked and has not been answered by the county specifically. But there may well be a concern there from a county perspective. I would be very surprised if there were not a concern. You also mentioned workers' comp, I believe, and the travel policy, and we have differentiated Workers' Compensation Act rules as it applies to this topic from other employment laws. We provide a pretty detailed analysis of that, and it is appropriate for workers' comp to be provided to the appointed members for reasons that are particular to that particular act. Similarly, I think the point is well taken that Chair Kehoe just built upon, which is that to the extent that your travel policy provides for reimbursement of actual and necessary expenses related to medical expenses incurred while traveling on LACERA business, that is very reasonable, both in an international and domestic context, and could be incorporated into your policy, provided, however, that you're not double paying. So for example, if you have an active employee, county employee who's on the retirement board and under SERL, their services on the retirement board are deemed to be part of their services rendered on the job. So that's actually, I know there was a reference made by Trustee Bernstein about not wanting to divide and conquer among board members, and I agree with that in principle. But the fact is, because you come to the board from all these different places, you have certain different rights and responsive rights from one another. And employees may well be able to, county employees may well be able to call on the county to pay for some of those expenses. And you wouldn't want LACERA to be paying for expenses that the county is supposed to be paying for. But with that caveat, I agree that the travel policy is a place where reimbursements of a medical nature could be addressed in those contexts, those limited contexts of travel for LACERA. Bob, I stepped in there quickly. I don't know if you have.
No, I happen to agree with that point. I was actually going to address the civil service question, because one of the first things that I looked at, being an old union lawyer, is I said, okay, what do the civil service rules say? And the civil service rules talk about positions. And is this a position? And then it says, well, it's a position in the classified service unless it says it's not. And then that leads you to section 33 of the county charter, which says members of all commissions, committees, and boards created by the charter, statute, or ordinance are excluded from the classified service. Now, the question is whether or not are you now in the unclassified service? I don't read it that way. But again, I think this is one of those circumstances where, what exactly are you? I think you're an officer. You're a county officer created by statute, by state statute. And so, but I think you are largely regulated by the state. So I don't think the civil service rules offer anything other than another unwelcome level of confusion to an already confusing problem. But I think it was the right place to look, because it was actually one of the first places that I looked, because I wanted to know, there are places where boards get a salary. I mean, not in California that I'm aware of, but in other states where I go, there are boards that get a salary for being on a board or commission. And even though they're considered officers, They're not anybody's employee in that sense. That's just what the legislature in that place decided to do. The board doesn't, these are boards that don't, they're just like you. They don't report to anybody except themselves. They have a statutorily designated function, yet the entity that created them decided to pay them a recompense equivalent or appropriately representative of the work performed. And it kind of gets back to Trustee Bernstein's observation. I don't think anybody presumed that the work that you all have taken on to yourselves was contemplated by the modest stipend that's provided for in the statute. It's just not. And the question is whether or not, besides the legislative question, I'm sure SIR will be amended, is perhaps this leads to a whole other discussion of governance. And are you taking as trustees on issues and legwork that really ought to be performed by staff? And that's a whole discussion for another day, but that I think is going to need to inform your decision or anybody else who has the ability to make a decision about compensation is what do you have to do? What do you want to do? And what could you give to somebody else to?
The only sort of point I'd make in response to that, to Bob, your comments there is I would characterize the trustees as public officials rather than using the term officer, because LACERA uses the term officer and employee sort of interchangeably in certain ways. And your officers are certainly your CEO and your other chiefs.
Yes.
But you are all public officials, and you're public officials who manage public investments, which is why you're subject to all the conflict of interest rules that we've been talking about, et cetera. So that's it.
Thank you.
No,
I think
words matter.
I think it's settled. The board does too much work, and we need our own personal assistants assigned to each of us so that we can get our work done now. So just as a time check, we're coming up on the 3-hour mark for this meeting. I do have Mr. Bernstein in the queue. I will note that at this point, this is a report item for discussion only. We don't need any action on it. We have 2 takeaways, I believe, for staff items that we'll talk about at the next item. But I will, at this point, we're, I think, bringing this conversation to either a close or direction to staff. So I'll turn this over to Mr. Bernstein.
Thank you. Bob, I would note that there are boards in Los Angeles. The city of Los Angeles has boards where appointees are paid salaries, I believe 6-figure salaries. Does that information matter? Does it have any impact on anything that you and Ashley have considered and thought about?
It only would matter in the sense of making a case to the legislature about why shouldn't you get one, at least a higher pay for what you do. But in terms of the legislative prescription that both Ashley and I see about the ability of anybody other than the legislature to change the pay, the answer is no.
So, and I want to be mindful of the time and do my part to wrap things up. Is it fair to summarize that the 2 of you are describing the current system as unjust, but sort of unfixable?
Outside of legislation.
I would say it's unfixable by yourselves. I think the stipend is unfixable by the county. I think it's fixable. It is fixable, but by the legislature. And as far as unjust, are you asking my personal opinion from 9 months?
I believe I'm repeating what you said, actually, but
no, it is, and that is my observation from now working with you for almost 10 months. And the answer is, yeah, I think you do a lot of work for not a lot of money. And you know, I respect that you do that. And that's one of the things that makes it good to work with you, is that you're dedicated to what you do. You set the right example, behavioral example. Is it fair? Probably not.
I'd make one more observation, which relates to some topics that Trustee Kelly raised about the retiree member on the board. There are some other considerations if, say, as a result of being appointed to, being elected to the board, the retiree then drew a salary from LACERA. You might have retiree annuitant problems, tax issues, reinstatement into active membership dynamics that would need to be assessed. I view the dynamic here, well, it's a sort of the moral part of this is hard to kind of opine on, and I don't really know that that's my place, but I do view this as more of a volunteer dynamic where the appointees are, while you're getting paid for your work, you're essentially volunteering the tremendous services that you're providing to LACERA and its members and beneficiaries. So lots of volunteers are not paid for tremendous work that they provide. Whether in this context, the legislature should step in and address that is for them to decide.
So I would simply say in conclusion that I'm not sure. It's an excellent presentation. It's well written. It's well researched. I'm not sure there's anything to be done. If there's something to be done, I wish we could figure it out. It is sort of a closed loop that we've been talking in. But if not, as I believe the appointed trustee who's been here the longest, the amount of time in the 11 years I've been here has vastly increased. And if this is a situation we're stuck with, I would throw out to this committee and staff that I think we have an ethical obligation to really evaluate, do we need to keep adding meetings? Do we need to keep adding responsibilities and time commitments to volunteers? It is effectively a more and more burdensome process in the time that I've been here. And apparently there's no avenue for rewarding that. So perhaps we need to look more closely at whether we really need to be requiring it.
Thank you. That brings us to Mr. Santos.
Thank you, Mr. Kehoe. I just want to comment on Mr. Bernstein's latest comment in terms of the amount of the work. I agree wholeheartedly that especially with the establishment of the different committees that really increased the work for everybody. So, I mean, one of the things that we could think about in the future, for example, is can we combine the administrative meeting with the disability meeting for the BOR? At one point, we had 2 meetings for the Board of Investments. It used to be the second week and the fourth week of every month. And we concluded that we can do all the work of the BOI in one day, including the committee meetings. That has been working quite well, in my view, for now a number of years. And I think maybe we should take a look at how we can combine the BOR meetings into one. Thank you.
Thank you. So what we'll do with that, because I don't want to overstep the bounds of the drug C, I think that each of our respective boards are covered in this committee, so we can definitely take that back to our boards and analyze the workload that we currently have. So with that, and without seeing any additional comments from anybody, we will go ahead and receive and file this report without objection, and we will proceed with our items for staff review. And by the way, thank you very much for all of the legal analysis, the discussion. This was very helpful in bringing a lot of unanswered questions out there. So thank you.
Glad to work with you. Do you need us to stay on for the remainder of the agenda?
I think we're about to wrap it up. So maybe if you can stand by while we do our staff review, just in case there's any issues that come up.
Thank you.
Perfect.
Okay, so the committee requested, the first item was a list of entities in the quiet period to be added to the CEO report or other, like another avenue. The second item was a tax analysis on item 5A for future discussion at a future meeting. The third item was travel insurance be reviewed for domestic trustee travel. And also the last item was review the board and committee schedule.
I would ask that we scratch that last direction because that would be an overstepping of the jog C. So those are individual board handles.
Okay.
So outside of that, without objection from everybody, that's the items for staff review. And now we'll go to the order. Linda, could you?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Mr. Santos?
Yes, thank you. I want to thank the attorneys of the staff for the tremendous work done for this meeting today. It falls right in line with what Mr. Bernstein was saying in terms of the amount of work that we've been doing. But it was great discussion on all different items. Really appreciate everybody's comment, and you have a beautiful day. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Kelly? You're on mute. You're muted.
Thank you. Sorry. Thank you very much to staff and specifically the attorneys for your assistance in today's meeting. I did want to note that I am increasingly concerned about the Delta variant out there, and I would, and there have been a number of developments in recent weeks about requirements for mandatory vaccinations among groups, from Hollywood production companies to the president of France to Indiana University and its requirement, which was upheld by a federal judge. So I do think it would be, I would be interested in Mr. Kryman including in his next written CEO report a consideration of what would need to occur further for LACERA to have a mandatory vaccination program. In the meantime, be vaccinated and be safe. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next, I will call on Ms. Gray.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank Bob and Ashley for your hard work on this report. It's very well done. It gives us a lot of food for thought. And speaking of food for thought, I'd also like to thank Mr. Kelly for all the, now see, here we go, for all the work that he has done. Though I may, butt heads with him on some of his suggestions, I totally appreciate what you do, Joe, because it makes us, number one, just think about what you did. What you did was make us all review our code of conduct, our media policy, all of those things. Although some of your, suggestions, I may not have agreed with, or I felt we were getting into the weeds. Without what you did, it would just be, oh, well, okay, we've had it since 2009. Let's just keep moving on. No, we actually addressed it. And I think that is important. And that's a lot of work. You do a lot, Joe, and I thank you for that. I also thank staff for everything that they've done. It just was a very good meeting. It did require a lot of work and a lot of thought. And for me, writing down all of my questions and also making them sort of succinct, if I may say so, and also, so that everyone can understand what the heck I'm saying, because sometimes I get it sort of confused. But I'd like to thank everyone for all of the work that they've done. And Mr. Rice, your undying input that's always there. We call on you a lot, and it's spur of the moment, and you have to pull these thoughts out of your head or where you have notes and everything else. And I thank everyone. So everyone have a great week.
Thank you. Ms. Greenwood?
I just wanted to thank everybody for their hard work, and the hard work that went into this meeting. I too would like to encourage everybody to get a vaccine and stay as safe and healthy as you can, and have a great rest of the week.
Thank you. Mr. Bernstein?
I want to say with some nostalgia that the next time we have to do a 3-hour review of ethics, I really hope we can have Bonnie and Linda providing apple fritters or those macadamia white chocolate chip cookies. It makes it a little bit easier to get the job done. On a more serious note, I want to commend Chair Kehoe. Having a board that has different views, different backgrounds, different opinions, talk about ethics for 3 hours can be very contentious and tough. And this was there was healthy disagreement, but it was a collegial and productive meeting, I thought, from start to end. And I really appreciate when we can dive into things where we don't always agree, but do it with support and respect for each other. And I thought this meeting really evinced that. I want to thank our staff and our fiduciary council for the tremendous amount of work that they put in. And finally, although I agree with Chair Kehoe that we should not be recommending what the boards do in terms of their workloads, since Mr. Knox is not able to be here today, perhaps staff can just refer the suggestion on that we as individual boards consider looking at it, not as a recommendation, which I agree we shouldn't be making, but so that the two boards can consider looking at workload. I thought Mr. Santos's comments in that regard were excellent, and I agree with him. And I think that would be something we might want to consider.
Thank you. Mr. Kramer?
I just want to wish everybody a good week.
Thank you. Mr. Lugo?
Likewise, I appreciate the conversation. And for me, being week 2, it's diving into ethics for 3 hours is really good for me to hear perspectives on both sides of the board, BOR and BOI. But wish everyone a good rest of your day and rest of your week. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Popovich?
I just agree with Mr. Lugo. There's a lot of and Mr. Kryman. Everybody should have a great day. But there's a lot of great discussion that happened today, and I appreciate everybody's thoughts, and I appreciate all the work that everybody did. So thank you very much.
Yes, sorry. And I skipped Ms. Sanchez. I didn't see that she was still on, so I'll go back to Ms. Sanchez.
Well, this has been a fascinating conversation to listen to while passing a kidney stone. But I just want to continue to appreciate the fact that these are noticed as joint meetings of the boards, because it is, even though we are not on the committee, it's great to be able to make comment while the sort of substantive comments form the recommendation that come to the board, so that we don't have to rehash it entirely at the board level if something is interesting and we want to make a comment. So I just want to reiterate how helpful that is.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Ginsburg? Okay, I don't see her. Mr. Rice?
Just want to echo the thanks to all committee trustees, fiduciary council, the lawyers behind the scene, management, the other staff involved in this. We covered 5 major issues today in a 3-hour meeting, and it's great to get all the guidance and direction. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me see who else I have. Mr. Grable?
Nothing to add.
Okay, thank you. And if any of the fiduciary councils want to make a comment. Okay. Okay, lastly.
Thank you for the opportunity to work with you.
That's exactly what I was going to say. Thank you for having us. We appreciate the opportunity to serve, and these are very important issues that you're discussing.
Thank you. And Chair Kehoe.
Thank you, and I appreciate Mr. Bernstein's comments. I was actually going to turn it all around to everybody here and all the committee members that I appreciate the collegiality and the comments and the discussions and the thoughtfulness and everything that got along here. I will admit that I was a little nervous walking into the meeting. I didn't know how this would turn out, and I think that it worked out very well. And that everybody had an opportunity to be heard and to move in a proper direction. So I definitely appreciate everyone's thoughtfulness on this, and I thoroughly enjoyed the meeting. So that being said, I will take a motion for adjournment.
So moved.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.
You too. Have a great day.